this particular location. Now, pineal gland. It's typically represented as a pine cone in its representation because of its shape, and that leads to some very curious representations in ancient mythology and in art. If you look in the ancient followers of Osiris, you will actually see that he carries a shaft, a rod or shaft that he carries with a pine cone on the top of the shaft. Similarly, Dionysus, who was a liminal god, or a god that controlled the contact between the spirit world and human world, who actually had a process by which his followers entered an altered state via drugs to be able to make this contact in this ecstatic state. He was known by carrying a similar rod that had a fennel shaft made out of fennel, the plant material, with a pine cone on top of it. And his followers, the maidens, the Maenades, actually would carry a similar staff with a pine cone on top. Well, it doesn't just end at the ancient world. If you look at pictures of the popes, they actually carry a similar shaft that has a pine cone near the top of the shaft itself. The same kind of designation. And in fact, it goes even closer connection. If you go to the Vatican and you look in the Vatican Square, you will find an area called the Court of the Pine Cone at the Vatican. And they have there the largest pine cone statue in the world. And from my research, it suggests that it was actually taken from the nearby temple of Isis. It was actually transported from there in the early days of the church, from that temple, and put in the Vatican. And I've never seen any explanation from church figures on why a pine cone would be there or the significance of it. It may be there, but I don't. But it can't be more than a curiosity that this memory, ancient connected memory of a pine cone and its significance for contact with the gods is still present. Now, just discussing about some other chemicals. Serotonin, which is a related neurotransmitter chemical. As I mentioned, serotonin, melatonin, DMT is a similar one. Serotonin is produced by the pineal gland and elsewhere in the body. It is synthesized by L-tryptophan. L-tryptophan is the base product that these chemicals like serotonin and others are made from, even artificial chemicals that we now take. Serotonin affects mood, increases aggressiveness, and even affects swarm behavior in locusts, which is very interesting when we talk later about locusts. But general aggressiveness in people is a byproduct of its uptake. In fact, it is present in the venom of wasps and stingers to increase pain. And there's a particular type of scorpion that was in Israel, that's in Israel now. It's called something like a death scorpion. It actually has serotonin in its particular venom in the scorpion, and it brings you almost to death. It is so severe. It typically will not kill a healthy individual, but it brings them close to death because it is such a severe impact. Now, tests that have been done, medical tests with serotonin, just administering that to people, have shown that people can have religious experiences or similar kind of, or even obsessive compulsive disorder can come out of serotonin uptake. But religious mystical events occur as well. Now, the artificial hallucinogen or entheogen chemicals, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, LSD, they all interact with serotonin receptors and basically replace its interaction. So they actually can go in and when serotonin is low and actually replace it and do the same effect on the nerve receptors. Most antidepressants that are taken are focused on altering serotonin levels for the same purpose. So this is a key in affecting who we are, how we perceive ourselves, and our reality itself. Now, here's another curiosity that I stumbled across, and again, it may not be connected at all, but when you hear the punchline at the end of this talk, I want you to remember this process. It may have some curious connection. There is a process by which pine cones preserve their seeds, their internal seeds, to disperse until they're exposed to fire. When they're exposed to fire, they will have a sudden explosion and release their seeds to regerminate. And this process is called serotiny. And serotiny is the process, again, and it's used in, for example, forest fires. When a fire has raged through a thick forest and these burned pine cones will actually be activated by the fire to release their seeds to repopulate it. I think there is a mystical connection there that hopefully I'll refer to in just a moment. Let me pursue with another entheogen that has its own potential revelations. This is something that not too many people know about, but people are starting to find out about real quick, including myself. And this actually is an alcoholic drink, a spirit, ironically called a spirit, called absinthe. Absinthe is known by most people as the green fairy or the green goddess, and that's because in its normal state it has a pale green color. It is a highly alcoholic distilled beverage. Its key ingredient that makes it absinthe is it uses the wormwood plant. And the Greek name, the official plant name, Latin would be Artemisia absinthium. And it also uses fennel in it and a few other ingredients as well. And remember, we've already mentioned fennel and its connection with the pine cone and these staffs in the spirit world. But again, it has this pale green color, and it makes this very special material, as you're going to hear. Now, absinthe was the obsession of European culture in the late 1800s. It actually has a connection far back to the ancient world. This wormwood-based alcoholic beverage was actually known in the Greek world as absinthonites oinos, or absinthe wine, and it was used in the worship of Dionysus. It was used to get them into an ecstatic state where the Maenads would actually be totally filled with his presence, have contact with him, and at the same time, they would run, according to the ancient writers, run across the hillside. If they grabbed oxen or large animals, they would rip them apart, limb from limb, and then consume them while these animals were still living, consume the raw material. Even humans, it was reported that they would actually do this too. They were a terror, and these were women, maidens that actually got together, went into the state. So it has ancient connections. It was even used for medicinal uses and things like this. But its real golden age was in the late 1800s in Europe. It was very popular with the bohemian artist bad boys of the era that we know well in literature. People like Oscar Wilde, Vincent van Gogh, Salvador Dali, Pablo Picasso, Monet, Hemingway. They all were voracious consumers of absinthe. And they all claimed that what was unique about it was that it connected them to their muse, or their spirit being that would actually inspire them and tell them what to do in their artistic endeavors. Many of these consumers, ironically, end up going mad later. They were actually left insane eventually due to the absinthe or other reasons. And not surprisingly, Aleister Crowley was obsessed with it. He actually consumed it in, of all places, New Orleans, at a place called the Old Absinthe House. And he just loved it. Of course, anything that would contact the spirit world, he was enamored with. And he wrote a poem about it called "The Green Goddess." And actually, the poem was recited that the person who was supposedly writing it was Apollo, the god Apollo. So I want you to remember that Apollo here is appealing to the virtues of the Green Goddess, and keep that in mind. Now, Marilyn Manson, a person who has tried his best to keep the Aleister Crowley legacy of being the wickedest man alive and doing everything he can possible to offend Christians and the Christians' God. Not surprisingly, he has found the joys of absinthe himself. In fact, one of his recent albums, he says, was recorded and conceived, written while he was under the influence of absinthe. Now, the effect of consumption of absinthe was understood in society at the time to create a condition they called absintheism, which was some kind of degraded physical state that is much, much worse than alcoholism. And if you look at the slides and pictures, you will actually see some beautiful art from that era where you see this green goddess or green fairy actually seducing men and just driving them to ruin, basically. As a result, in the widespread abuse of this chemical, it was banned in most of Europe, almost all of Europe and the United States, ironically, until just recently. Just recently it's come back. And in my presentation, I actually have pictures of the